Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Don't Praise the Machine, the Survivor's Guide to the Cultural Apocalypse. Today, we're talking about the sovereign citizen movement. Now, for most of us, these are the people we see in YouTube clips screaming, "I am a living man," while a window gets smashed in a suburban traffic stop. But last week in Australia, it turned deadly. A man named Desi Freeman, a guy who lived deep in the sovereign citizen rabbit hole, was shot and killed after a manhunt. He'd previously allegedly shot two police officers because he believed they were trespassing on his land. This is no longer just an American fringe movement anymore. Thanks to the digital chimney of the internet, this pseudo-legal belief system has moved from the US to Australia, the UK, and beyond. It's a world of magic words, capital letters, and the belief that you can just opt out of the law if you use the right hyphenation. So today, we're going to unpack the straw man theory, trace the roots of this anti-government logic, and look at how these ideas escalate from annoying courtroom filings to actual tragedy. But before I get started, I'm going to need a man who believes the order to comply is more of a philosophical question. He's John. I'm not driving, I'm just traveling, Officer Maloney. John, how are you feeling about the system today?
I don't even recognize it. So I've just bottomless indifference is how I feel towards the system.
You should say, Alex, I do not recognize you as the host of this podcast.
Am I free to leave? Am I being detained?
Yes, that's right. Am I forced to, are you saying that I am required to record this podcast?
Exactly. Yeah.
Or am I free to leave of my own
I'm
volition?
demonstrating my personal sovereignty by wearing our very own micronation, the DPTM Patreon t-shirt. I like to think of that as a kind of secession from the nation state of Australia and Germany, respectively, and the creation of a third state of DPTM.
DPTMistan.
Yeah, and I'm also drinking a Guinness 0.0 out of a cognac glass, which just happened by accident. But I like to think that's also just a way of not complying with the usual rules.
We should also point out at the start of this episode, John, as we rarely do, that you are a barrister. So
that's true.
This is probably something that we should point out more at the start of. I bet if we had a marketing person, the first thing they would say is, "You have a barrister on the show. Why are you not mentioning that every time the show starts? Like, that's your point of interest."
Yeah.
But normally I'm just like, there's this goofball in Melbourne who just wants to talk about TikTok.
I mean, that's also an apt description. But yeah, I mean, this is a kind of an issue that, you know, many barristers will have stories about brushing up against the sovereign citizen movement and encountering, as you said in the introduction, strange court filings, receiving unsolicited emails. So I can kind of talk a little bit about some of those stories.
This is fantastic. I had no idea until just before we started recording this episode that you had real brush ups with this, and that people contact you specifically from this movement asking about, you know, if they have legal challenges. So that's something that's going to be super fun to get into. So perhaps we could start by just explaining what the movement is. It's from the US, and it's essentially an anti-government movement. So what is a sovereign citizen? So at the core, basically the people from this movement believe that governments are illegitimate or secretly corrupt, and that laws don't apply to you unless you consent, and that you can opt out of the legal system with certain phrases and other ways of saying that the law does not apply to you. So it's these ideas that you are not a citizen, because like a citizen, they think in the traditional sense makes you have this kind of separate legal identity that they call the straw man, and you say, I'm not the straw man, this person, this entity that you're trying to get to pay tax and get a driver's license. I do not recognize that authority. They believe the straw man theory basically creates a fake version of you at birth. That when you're born, the straw man is created, this legal entity which they do not believe is legitimate. And so they have more of an idea that laws are consent based, which is fascinating to me.
The straw man is kind of an interesting concept, because it does make a certain amount of sense. This idea that, for every actual flesh and blood person, there's a kind of bureaucratic simulacrum of that individual made up of, documents that exist at birth, deaths, and marriages, or whatever the kind of equivalent institution might be. That, you've got your birth certificate, you've got your passport, you might have like a police file, you might have a tax file number, you've got a social security number in some places, and that's all you as far as the state is concerned, and as far as the, in part as far as the law is concerned. But they say that's all just a kind of fiction and a construct, which it is in a sense, but I suppose. But I remember studying these ideas, kind of so-called contractarian ideas, that some of which go back hundreds of years, which really as a bit of a philosophical device, as a way of understanding the relationship between a governing state and its people, had this idea that there was a so-called social contract, which is a phrase you hear all the time, that, there was, you can imagine a point where people all came together and agreed to be bound by this system of laws, and, the government in turn agreed to comply with certain limitations in its power, or whatever it might be, or representative obligations in a democracy. And they would say, well, that implies, a capacity to opt out and or to not have entered into that agreement. And so, in a sense, either they never did, or they, as you say, they've kind of found some magic incantation that means that cancels the state's authority over them. And they often have kind of bizarre readings of historical events or historical documents, which they take to be evidence that they never actually consented to this arrangement, or that the state's assertion of sovereignty over them is just a falsehood.
Yeah, I read the Magna Carta and also old maritime law. They're quite into as well.
Totally.
Yeah, and so, as you say, these kind of ideas have been around for hundreds of years. It does kind of make more sense when you think about the birth of a nation, because you can imagine that there would be a point at which you were not governed by some sort of authority that oversaw the land and the citizenry. And you could imagine somebody knocking on your door and going, "Oh, hey, everybody's on board now. We're all going to forge this country." And you'd be like, "Hang on, I didn't agree to that." It's kind of funny, isn't it? Like when you think about it in that sense, you kind of go, "Oh, yeah, maybe there was a moment where you could sort of go, I don't really accept your authority over me in this sense."
Yeah,
but so in the 60s and 70s, it sort of grew out it started to grow in the US out of an anti-tax kind of movement with a backlash to federal power and taxes. I saw a lot in my research the emergence of a body called the Posse Comitatus, who believed that government was illegitimate, taxes were illegal, and only local sheriffs had authority. And it was also connected to white supremacist ideology, anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. Anti-Semitic and conspiracy tend to go together. And then early forms of what they call paper terrorism, which, maybe you can we'll expand on, I'm sure, a little bit as we go into this, where the sovereign citizen movement loved to kind of hold up courts by filing various papers that just clog the system. And then in the 1980s and 90s, there was a bit of militia expansion. We're talking about Cold War, paranoia, distrust of federal authority. And the ideas get a bit stronger from fringe ideology to a subculture. I think Waco and also the Oklahoma City bombing, I think some of them
of course.
were Timothy McVeigh.
He was kind of that ilk, wasn't he? As well as people like Kaczynski, the Unabomber, was a little bit sort of sovereign citizen-y. I mean, he had his own ideas, but he was certainly about kind of winding back the industrial state and kind of basically, a form of anarchy.
Yeah. Then 2008, you can start to understand how these ideas start to gain power and how they start to gain an audience. So you have the financial crisis in 2008. So basically like systematic collapse. So you might have your savings in a particular vehicle, a particular financial vehicle, the system collapses and you're just like, well, I've been fucking working my whole life and I put all my money into this thing that you were supposed to protect and make sure that I was taken care of. And now, debt's skyrocketing, trust is collapsing, the government bails out the banks. So you can start to see people going like, I'm not feeling too good about what's going on here.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm very skeptical about this. And then this is also, of course, around the time that, the internet's growing and growing. So these ideas are spreading where people are on there saying, hey, have you heard about the sovereign citizen movement? You don't have to pay your debts. The system is a fraud.
Yeah.
People are saying there's legal loopholes where you can get around things. And then just to round this out, John, 2010s, again, YouTube starts to explode. And so now you've got people that are spreading these ideas in videos saying, hey, there's like legal hacks that you can use. Just if a police officer pulls you over and says, sir, do you have a driver's license to be driving this vehicle? And you can just say, I'm not driving, I'm traveling. So you can't accuse me of driving. That's a big one. And then
what
of course,
even is driving?
What even? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. What even is driving? I'm moving. I'm just moving atoms from place A to place B, and I need a license for that. And then, of course, COVID era. We're talking mass government skepticism. The government's, saying people have to get vaccinated and these kinds of things, and the conspiracy theories.
Really turbocharges the whole thing, right? And puts a lot of wind in sails. I mean, I find the role of the internet. That's one of the things that really made it appealing to me as a DPTM topic, because it's so pivotal when you think about even the way that sovereign citizens in Australia talk now and the kinds of phraseology that they use and the kind of, legal theory that they base their ideas on. Sometimes it is kind of naively and directly lifted from the American context, and they start, talking to you about all these, sort of concepts that actually have no place in the Australian legal or political landscape because they're so directly and immediately influenced by that. But you have these movements that I guess previously you'd have kind of, I guess, the chance to, like with Waco, you'd have the chance in a small isolated place in America to kind of organically spread these ideas among a small committed group of people. Maybe you're mailing people or phoning them or God knows what. And then suddenly you get this kind of unlimited capacity to seed these ideas and to sort of spread them across America. And then eventually, apparently it was kind of initially into Canada and then internationally, to the UK and to Australia. And as well as that, you get, people with a business model that's founded on that. So people through YouTube and things running like paid seminars and paid subscription services that are based on learn my tricks for, not having to pay your tax, not having to, have documents when you travel, whatever it might be. And yeah, it's definitely found a home in Australia for reasons that we might explore. I think it's kind of Australia's kind of, well set up to receive this and appropriate its own version of this kind of ideology.
Yeah, so let's talk about Desi Freeman, John, because I'm particularly interested in hearing about this from yourself, because I have just had a little bit of news come through about him. But perhaps you could tell us about Desi, like who he was and what incident occurred that meant that there was a manhunt.
Sure. So Desi, whose real name is Desmond Philby, but who started going by Desi Freeman a few years ago, is someone who for many years has lived in rural Australia. And one of the key events that we'll come to in a moment occurred at his property. He was actually living in a bus with his family on a property in a place called Paulpunka, which
is a family.
He had a family, had a wife and kids, and he'd had a few previous brushes with the law. He had his license cancelled at some point. He had some disputes about welfare entitlements and taxes and things like this, and property disputes. He was actually on, I think it was a Current Affair or Today Tonight or one of these, which are basically a kind of low rent sort of neighborhood dispute, sensationalist news shows. And he was portrayed as the victim in that story, him and his wife. And they had kind of, this classic sort of neighbors who apparently had, like a typical story, neighbors who had, four-wheel motorbikes, and they were tearing around creating a nuisance of themselves, and Desi had had enough of it, and he was talking to Today Tonight about it and whatever. So there's all this kind of old footage of him that's, you can see if you're so inclined. And there are people who knew him from those days and even earlier who talked about him as this kind of relatively benign and in fact quite likable guy who was in the kind of, was a sort of off-grid hippie type character who would go to these alternative lifestyle festivals and show up and was a kind of, was a sort of hippie-ish sort of guy who had a good knowledge of the bush, who liked, the idea of sort of living close to nature, who had pretty good survival skills, etc. And at some point he started to kind of get radicalized, and it's not entirely clear whether that was just, in part, I think he had some mental health stuff. His legal disputes with the government started to get more intense. It looked like there was some accusations of child sex offending, which were in the mix as well. And so by the time of the last couple of years, he was seen as a bit more of a threat by the police and, a bit more of a kind of potentially volatile loner, and would show up to court and kind of aggressively, scream and yell and make a fuss and deny the legitimacy of the court and the police, and, had this view that the state was out to get him, etc. And so they went to his house, and this was in, I think, August last year, August 2025. They went to this bus that he lived on with his wife and kids in Port Punker. And they were there to serve a warrant on him, I think, in relation to some of these criminal offences. And they brought several cops, which is an indication of how dangerous they regarded him as even then. Mm. I think there was about 10 cops who fronted up at his property, which is pretty unusual for that kind of, for serving a legal process. But and he was obviously expecting them, and managed to kind of to shoot and kill two of them. I think seriously injured a third. And, these were kind of well-armed, sort of tactically skilled policemen. So it was a kind of incredible, it was a very unlikely thing that he then managed to escape into the bush. And Port Punker, for anyone who's kind of not from these parts, is in the sort of so-called Victorian high country, so kind of alpine parts of country Victoria, pretty remote, pretty kind of rugged, mountainous bush, and not an easy place to navigate if you don't know what you're doing, and not an easy place to kind of hide out for any length of time. And the cops, unsurprisingly, launched a massive manhunt for him, which was one of the largest ever in Victoria's history, combing through the bush and talking to anyone who they knew who knew him, and going to various, sovereign citizen contacts that they had, because they knew that he was kind of, by that point, enmeshed in that community and might be kind of being harbored by people, etc. And they never found him for months and months. They thought, either he's hiding out, and they made obviously various appeals to people saying, if you're harboring him, come forward now, you could get into a lot of trouble. They offered I think $1 million reward for anyone who could provide evidence leading to his, or, a tip-off leading to his capture. And they also investigated reports from around that time of the standoff of a gunshot nearby, which led a lot of people to assume that he must have shot himself soon after this siege with cops, and was probably just, lying in an isolated part of the bush. I mean, it's pretty hard terrain to find a body.
Right.
And there's there's also lots of, because Victoria had a lot of gold mining in the 19th century. There's still a lot of kind of old abandoned mine shafts and stuff around. And so, it's pretty hard terrain where a lot of people, I think assumed, well, he's more than likely died or either deliberately or, of exposure or whatever, and is just lying somewhere, and they'll find him maybe never, maybe in years' time. And so the search kind of continued but died down, and people sort of, cautiously moved on. But of course, there was always this sort of slight undercurrent of kind of folkloric mystery that developed around what the hell happened to Desi Freeman, and people in the sovereign citizen community, some of them naturally kind of started, valorizing him a little bit.
Right.
And very surprisingly, I just assumed he's almost certainly just dead somewhere, and that's the last we'll ever hear of it. But very surprisingly, just days or a couple of weeks ago now, in a place, Thaloggalong, I think it's called, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, which is about 150 kilometres from Pawnpukka, so a long way away, not somewhere it's very unlikely he could have gotten there just on his own steam. It's right up near the border with New South Wales on the southern side of the Murray River, for those who know what I'm talking about. And he was on a property there. Police obviously got wind that he was there a couple of days before they confronted him, and did sort of aerial scans of the place. And there were these shipping containers on the property, and it looked like a kind of a bit of a sort of survivalist weirdos enclave type property. It's a pretty isolated part of the country, and then they confronted him. They sent in tactical police. And we don't really, details are still kind of emerging of exactly what happened, but it looks like he was offered the chance to surrender peacefully and instead, came out armed and confronted the police and was shot and killed. A shot over 20 times, which has led some people to think, well, maybe the police having, understandably some grievances about someone who killed their colleagues had it in for him, but that's all still to be worked out. And so that's the story of Desi Freeman. He was 56 when he died. And as I say, it was a kind of long, slow descent from this kind of, in a way, his kind of radicalization is a story which is a microcosm of this trajectory of the sovereign citizen movement more broadly, from something which is pretty kind of whimsical and, fringy and kind of funny, to something which was obviously considered a bit more of a genuine threat to the public. And part of that is, because of the power of the internet, because these people now have sort of such power to radicalize each other, to kind of spur each other on, to coordinate, and to try and sort of run basically campaigns to destabilize sources of authority and law enforcement, that I think now, there's lots of discussions going on in Victoria in particular about, well, how big of is this something we should worry about? And, who are these people and what the hell they're about? And, it was, and it's a fascinating, Australia's kind of an interesting, environment for these kinds of ideas, because, lots of people will have heard of Ned Kelly. Some people might have heard of the Eureka Stockade. So for those who don't know, Ned Kelly was a kind of bushranger, basically a kind of highwayman, but he became a sort of folkloric hero because of his resistance to the authorities in Victoria, and this was in the 19th century in country Victoria. So obviously there were kind of immediate, not necessarily comparisons, but contrasts with people were saying, that the risk here is that people who are so inclined will say this is a kind of new Ned Kelly. He's a kind of anti-authoritarian hero and blah, blah, blah. And then you've got things like the Eureka Stockade, which was a kind of began as a miners' strike and ended with kind of, as I understand it, sort of fledgling attempts to start a micronation, etc., which is also something that Ned Kelly talked about towards the end of his life, was kind of seceding from the state of Victoria and starting this new nation. And those ideas have always had a certain currency, I think, in Australia because and sovereign citizenship and, you know, the idea of sort of declining to be part of the sovereign government. I think it's partly about, you know, the state as an institution, as a kind of settler colonial institution is very new. Australia was federated into the Commonwealth of Australia in 1901. And it's a huge country. It's kind of roughly as big as the continental US with only a fraction of its population. So there's lots of actual, you know, there's lots of kind of opportunities to go off and be a sovereign citizen weirdo if you're so inclined. If you like, you want to like buy a piece of land and just, you know, declare it a micronation. And there's lots of actually micronations. Even now, there's several that are kind of ongoing in Australia, and some of them, and they kind of run the gamut. Most of them are just sort of glorified hippie communes, basically, and others are kind of more just self-declared states, which are, you know, occupied by a fraudster or a tax cheat who wants to kind of justify what they're doing. And I think we kind of always have this, even though we're a very kind of regulated, very urbanized country, we've always got this soft spot for kind of rebels and people who are living outside the system. So yeah, it's kind of connects with some interesting themes, which I think is why it's taken root here, and why some of that sort of, you know, that kind of American, you can imagine that kind of American backwoodsman sort of mentality, that sort of survivalist, libertarian, you know, anarchist weirdo, that kind of translates pretty well to the Australian sort of, you know, remote parts of Australia, especially.
It's also, everything's also in English, John. So this is apparently an English-speaking world phenomenon.
Okay.
And also has a lot to do with common law and people's misunderstanding of precedents and things like this. And that you can go, if you can just find a case in the past that you think somewhat applies to your own case, that you can then say to the courts or whatever, oh, this doesn't apply to me because of blah blah blah. Something. And it also it feels very, when you read about it, it feels very QAnon-y.
Yes,
it feels
absolutely.
very internet-y. It feels very all those kind of, you know, the government is corrupt and it's just being run by a global cabal of lizard people. It seems to include a lot of that kind of stuff. It's weird watching the videos on the internet as well. I watched a couple of these we did the body cam episode last week. There's YouTube channels with a lot of sovereign citizen videos where the police say to them, you know, can you get out of the car, please, sir? And the person is just trying all of this mumbo jumbo, exactly what you were saying, kind of saying, what's a car? What do you mean? What do you mean? Who are you addressing when you talk to me? Blah, blah, blah. There's one great one that I watched where this poor guy's wife just has her head in her hands, just going, please just do what he says. And he's just doing, and you can just see that she's just been watching her husband on sovereign citizen forums, and she's just going, oh God, no, this is about to go terribly wrong.
There's all these, there's kind of great sort of mashups of the best, you know, because you've got these sort of internal toll booths and things in America, which sometimes are at state lines, sometimes are within states. And obviously they would, they're the kind of things that sovereign citizens like to question the legitimacy of, because you're in some way impeding their capacity to move freely on their own land or whatever, however they would characterize it. And so it's this bizarre sort of, they're quite entertaining, frankly, because it's this bizarre sort of, you know, it's a very sort of humdrum, you know, you've got a toll booth, you've got some underpaid public servant who's just bored shitless and doesn't want to have an argument about the social contract. And then you've got some guy who's saying, am I being detained? And the guy's like, fucking, I don't know, man. Jesus Christ.
Well, apparently some of those where the person in the toll booth is just like, I don't want to engage with this, so like do whatever. Those then get used on the internet of examples of, hey, look, it worked. Because my first question when I saw this, I was like, well, if this never works, then why are people so into it? And what I had read is there are examples where there will be an interaction with a police officer where the person says something, and it's like this one example where the cop just like shrugged their shoulders and was just like, yeah, whatever, I can't be fucked tonight, I don't want to do the paperwork. And then that just gets shown to everybody in the movement saying, look, it works, it works. As opposed to the thousands of other times when it didn't work.
Like someone like at a supermarket, and they say, can I see your bag? And like you just get someone going, nah, fuck off, and leaving. And then they're mostly just going to go like, well, whatever, I'm not going to like get into an altercation over my minimum wage security job.
This is the other thing that also makes it quite seductive, because of course there are certain things that people in positions of authority or police officers will encourage you to do, will try and persuade you to do. And if you do know your legal rights, and if you are the type of person who, for whatever reason, may be having constant interactions with the police and you have a good lawyer, your lawyer will tell you, hey, when they ask you to do this, refuse. Hey, when you do this, like I watched the Justin Timberlake body cam video recently, and they say to him, we want to give you a blood test, or we want to take blood, and he just goes like, no. And then they go, okay. And then obviously it moves to something else where there must be some sort of penalty, but it did appear that he didn't like they couldn't force him to do whatever they were asking. And I can imagine sovereign citizens would look at those kinds of things and just take it to more extremes.
Totally. Yeah. And there's obviously like legitimate kind of social media influencer lawyers who will say things about, what you should do if you're arrested, and giving a no comment interview, or asking to see a lawyer, things like, or not allowing them to, not consenting to them, going into your house without a warrant, all this kind of stuff, which is not legal advice, but and then obviously that's kind of, you can totally imagine that linking with a bunch of kind of apocryphal stuff about, if you just use this phrase, this kind of all the stuff like, people will say things like, if you ask a undercover cop if they're an undercover cop, they have to tell you, and all this sort of stuff.
Yeah.
This sort of made up sounding shit that people love, because it's sort of, I don't know, it appeals to these like one weird trick mentality that you can,
because you feel like you're in on you know something that nobody else does. It's again like QAnon-y, it's conspiracy theories, it's so everybody else is an NPC walking through the world, but you know the real truth of how things work. So that was Desi, and he was Neo. You're Neo, exactly. You're bending backwards and dodging the bullets. But yeah, so that was Desi. He was obviously, I mean, so how did they know? Was he in the forums? Did he scream out to police things like, I don't recognize your authority? How did they kind of know that he was such a sovereign citizen guy?
Yeah, he was definitely in the forums. He was on some kind of pseudo law podcast, as far back as like 2019, and kind of getting interviewed about, how to not pay tax or whatever it is, and these kind of topics. But then when he'd go to court, he'd often be quite, as I understand it, quite kind of volatile, and send sort of threatening letters to people and things like this. And they must have had an awareness that he had firearms. I mean, I'm not sure how. And
they may have been licensed,
They may have been, But I mean, I would have thought he wouldn't be a great candidate for having a licensed firearm. But I mean,
he wasn't into licenses.
Yeah, exactly. Well, there's all these kind of stories, like apparently his neighbours who weren't terribly fond of him talked to the media about how he was on the disability support pension for 20 years, and then people were saying, well, pretty unprincipled for someone who doesn't recognize the state to be like, well, but I will take your money. He's definitely a straw man when it suits him, but not when it fucking end of financial year he suddenly is a living being again. Yeah,
I was just going to ask. So again, this really interests me. You've received letters from people who are either in this community or seem to share some of these ideas or have heard about them. So what does that look like in your life at John Maloney and Partners?
Yeah. Well, I think it's a pretty common fixture. Maybe it's because I work in an area of practice as a barrister that is kind of adjacent to government law. So I don't know if people get my details that way or whatever, but I often work for or against government entities in legal disputes. And so I guess there's a potential for people in those kinds of disputes. There's always a kind of wing of that kind of work that's sovereign citizen-y, which used to be, isn't always threatening. I think usually isn't. But, it might be kind of people. There's always around tax time, there's a sort of bevy of people who put claims through the courts that, are based on, some spurious argument about the Magna Carta or the Australian Constitution,
right,
or the British, Acts of Parliament or whatever it is, that mean that they don't have to pay tax or that they don't have to pay this particular tax. And they sometimes make for interesting cases because they ask questions that, ordinary people who don't want to make their whole lives about being a sovereign citizen don't bother to ask, and sort of force the courts to go through, okay, well, why is this wrong, which can make for an interesting kind of discussion. And sometimes these people will, as will always happen, they'll win like 1 point out of 100 or something, and then that'll just give enough wind in their sails for them to keep going forever and ever. So we used to receive, when I was a judge's associate, so I worked at a court in Victoria, and you'd get like emails that are sent to the court or sometimes to your particular judge, and we would get on occasion sort of strange emails with, like a kind of Eureka Stockade flag in the banner, and they'd be telling us about how all the judges are corrupt bastards and they have no right to govern over these people, and, the Victorian state is a fraud and blah, blah, blah. And I mean, you just kind of generally ignore them, of course. And then now I will get on occasion emails to my personal address as a barrister that sort of say similar things like, Justice so-and-so said this, and that's bullshit, because if you go back to what, I don't know, fucking Lord Denning said in 1804 or something, in some case, it's actually not true. And blah. They've obviously like read this somewhere, and, some kind of bush lawyer, as we call them, like a kind of a person with a smattering of legal knowledge, but then a lot of kind of misinformation has put
this
together.
Is the term bush lawyer.
Yeah, we talk about like bush lawyers sometimes who are kind of, self-described sort of legal experts who really have don't have any formal credentials. Sometimes they're kind of, people who used to have credentials and then got kicked off or whatever, but they'll have like, they might have enough smarts to construct a sort of superficially attractive argument, which a lot of these sovereign citizens arguments are. If you don't know anything about anything, you kind of go, well, maybe, I don't know, sounds fancy and kind of right, and it suits my agenda. So they push all these arguments. And there are like, as I say, sometimes there's a legitimate basis to some of these arguments. And because, of course, sometimes like tax laws are framed improperly, and sometimes there's a legitimate basis to challenge, I don't know, the government compulsorily taking away your property or taxing you in a certain way or whatever. So they're not always baseless. And sometimes the people who work out those arguments are kind of wacky people with a bit of money and plenty of motivation. But, and there's all this stuff like in Australia, as I said, in particular, because we started as a set of British colonies, and because actually the kind of status of the Australian Constitution, because it started as a British Act of Parliament, is kind of slightly unusual and slightly questionable if you look at it in one light. So, if you're inclined to kind of start kicking holes in things, you can sort of have a crack at it. And the other thing that they've done in Australia is sort of piggyback onto some of the language of Aboriginal native title.
This was my next question that was going to come up is what makes us quite distinct, or perhaps not distinct. Maybe perhaps there are also Native Americans in the United States who have adopted sovereign citizenry for this same reason, because you can imagine that Indigenous Australians, they certainly were saying in 1788, I do not recognise the authority of any of you. So
exactly.
you can imagine that, that this is a kind of an interesting angle.
Yeah, and there's always been this strange alliance in America between sort of far right libertarians and Native Americans, and even some kind of white supremacists in America who have a sort of who kind of have a carve out for Native Americans who they might hold in high regard, because they sort of view them as the sort of original Americans and as having some kind of existence outside the state and being sort of autonomous in a way that they admire and whatever. And so I guess there are people in the Australian sovereign citizen movement who feel the same way, and there are probably some Aboriginal Australians who've adopted some of these arguments or kind of, who talk in similar terms about not recognising the state of Australia and things like that. So there's a strange kind of appropriation of terms from one context into another as well that goes on, I think. But yeah, I used to, I sometimes quite enjoy reading through these emails and just kind of finding out who these people are and what they've constructed. But as you say, it's kind of based on, flawed ideas about the common law and the legal status of documents like the Magna Carta and so on. But there used to be this guy, I don't want to defame anyone, but there used to be a barrister who's passed away now. He passed away last year, who was a kind of interesting, almost like a kind of sovereign citizen barrister who declared himself the sort of high, like a justice of a court that kind of existed mostly in his imagination, and would sort of take unsuspecting young lawyers under his wing who didn't realize what an eccentric take he had on the law, and would kind of so he was associated with a body called the International Tribunal for Natural Justice, which is a sort of faux court that somebody had set up, and had all these kind of suspect titles that he either had, maybe he paid for them the way that people pay for kind of they'll get you can get like an extinct baronetcy or something if you pay money to someone, or you can get like a title that doesn't mean anything, but is, if you sort of want to add it to your signature, then I guess you can. So he went by Sir John Walsh of Branner, and he was a kind of fascinating guy. He used to kind of rattle around the Victorian bar and had this sort of had sympathy for people, I think, in that kind of movement, because he was basically one of them. And he was eventually, I think, declared a vexatious litigant, as a number of these people are, which means that you've been running all these kind of spurious claims for so long that the court puts this order in place that says you need special kind of leave to raise any claims, etc.
Yeah, there's the paper terrorism.
Exactly. Yeah, because they'll just be, they'll have like 100 cases going at once against every goddamn body that there is, and sometimes, like, there was a guy a few years ago who was camping in a public park in the middle of Melbourne, and he had this kind of, had a court case going about that, but also about, I think he had a sheep, like a pet sheep, which you're not supposed to have within certain, boundaries of the city of Melbourne. And
Right.
the number of kind of higher court cases about sheep and dogs and things, because people fucking love, their animals, obviously.
You can't have a sheep in Brunswick.
Exactly. I don't think you can have a sheep or a cow or whatever, but there are people who do, and then they say, well,
what's a sheep?
Exactly. What is a sheep? Exactly. It's just a woolly. Why isn't it just a woolly dog? Let's just call it a dog. So yeah, they're fascinating people who I sort of find them. I mean, as most lawyers do, they're a bit of a nuisance and a distraction, but they're an object of fascination because they occasionally test the law in surprisingly interesting ways. Yeah. And obviously, if any of them are listening and can afford my fees, I'd be happy to run any of these wacky cases.
I was going to say, is this not a theme for Philosophical Foundations of Law at Melbourne University, John? Your lecture series that is the key sponsor of the podcast is that we use I've got the title right, correct? That's right. Philosophical Foundations of Law.
That's right.
Philosophical Foundations of Law. It sounds like you should get some sovereign citizens to come and speak to the class. And you can have the students pepper them with questions, and they'll defend themselves, and then your students will be forced to go, well, okay, well, I'm going to have to argue back against that now. Exactly. We're both going to have to know the law.
Good legal training, Why can't I rely on the Magna Carta? Or why isn't the Australian Constitution a tool of oppression? Maybe it is. I'm not.
Shut this school down.
Exactly.
You'll walk out and just lock the door and say, right. This is all going away.
Exactly. For visitors to Melbourne State Library as well, right here in Melbourne, you can, right in the city, you can go and see Ned Kelly's armor. I meant to take you to see it when you came and visited recently.
I've never seen it. I was a huge Ned Kelly fan as a child. I used to draw pictures and pictures and pictures of him. Again, it's just funny to think why that was. Like, why did I love him so much as a child? I just thought, he wears this, he's mysterious, he wears this cool mask, shoots cops. Why did I love people that killed cops so much when I was a kid? What's wrong with me?
We valorize cop killers in this country. Yeah. Strange for such a robustly regulated nation to have a secret kind of shadow love of people who hate authority. But I do also love the idea of you becoming the sovereign citizen barrister and just eventually becoming disbarred because you go all in on sovereign citizenry and just go, actually, they're right, and I'm going to get everybody off. None of my clients are going to pay tax or parking fines. Yeah. Here we go. John Walsh of Branner.
You met him, obviously.
I think I did meet him in passing, and I once had I very nearly was briefed by him to represent him in something, but I was unavailable to my great sadness. Would have been one for the memoirs for sure. But I mean, just his to see his LinkedIn or his VicBar page, because it's sort of this combination of genuine things, like he was a barrister for a time, together with, I'm the grand poobah of the Mystical Justice Foundation or whatever, like all this kind of stuff that didn't really exist, which reminds you of these kinds of movements. I mean, I was listening recently to a story about the history of the Ku Klux Klan, who were kind of associated with some of that stuff that, the kind of early progenitors of some of that ideology about, like, they rejected the federal government and they rejected the North as the kind of legitimate government and so on. And they had all these kind of wacky titles as well about, like, I'm the Grand Wizard and the Poobah and the goblins and the ghouls and all this shit.
Yeah.
And there is, I mean, part of the appeal, I'm sure, for them, for Sir John Walsh of Branner, and for sovereign citizens is just kind of being in this little, kind of slightly occultish club with its own little rituals and its own sort of arcane knowledge, right? Like, I'm a this, I'm a that, and I know about, like, I'm a living being, and I know that this is what you say in these situations, and blah blah blah. And I'm sure they get kind of props from each other for resisting, various notices from government and having various bits and pieces in the courts and whatever. So yeah. Funny.
Well, John, that has been the Sovereign Citizen episode, which I found fascinating. It was great to have an Australian law expert on the podcast once again. I think we need to do some more of these episodes. We need to pick more law, international and Australian, to utilize your expertise and those silly pieces of paper behind you.
Yeah, exactly. What do they even mean? It's just they're just Illuminati lies in frames. And now I can just use this. I can just say to my class, look, I'm going to go get a coffee. I'm just going to roll the tape and you can watch this episode of me and Al talking about sovereign citizens. I'll see you in an hour.
Or exactly that one, and maybe even the Australian social media ban for youth would be would be another one. Fantastic. Well, that's been this week's episode, everybody. If you've enjoyed this and you want to support the show, the best way you can do it is on Patreon, which is patreon.com/DPTM, or you can just Google Patreon, Don't Praise a Machine podcast, and there's 3 levels of membership tier that you can choose. Choose the tier that's right for you and your family. On all tiers, you get the episodes 1 day early, and you get the bonus once a month, Don't Praise the Machine After Dark, which we did this week as well. That has just come out, where we just rock and roll and rap, and it has a bit of a different vibe. It's kind of more like old school DPTM from 2021.
Yeah, it is actually.
Or so.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you so much, John, and we can't wait to see you next week.
Podcast.